Hello, movie nerds, and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, a podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to talk about the movie Emily. This is a new drama that just recently came out, and this movie is about the author Emily Bronte. Now, this movie is supposed to have taken place, or the period of time that it would have taken place would have been prior to Emily Bronte writing Wuthering Heights. So it kind of delves into what her family dynamic is, a little bit about the relationship between her and her sisters, and a little bit about like her education as far as the short period of time that she was a teacher, the very short period of time that she went off to the same school that her sister had a job at, and then it kind of spans through some bits of the relationship that she had with her brother. The vast majority of this film is the one thing that I hate about it, and we will get into that. So Emily Bronte and the Bronte sisters are very well known for having written some of what we consider like classic English fiction. Emily Bronte obviously wrote Wuthering Heights. One of her sisters wrote Jane Eyre. And then I can't remember the title of the name that her last sister wrote, but all three sisters essentially wrote a book that most all of us have either read in school or have at least heard about because they are pretty great. Now, when Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, it did not do particularly well at the time. It is obviously known as one of the great works of English fiction now, but at the time it was not very well received because people back then saw it as exactly what it was. It was very dark. It was very like brooding. It was the opposite of a lot of the books and fiction that were being published at the time, especially anything that was written by a woman. Now, back in that time, being a woman and being a writer was a much bigger deal than it would be today. It was a lot more of a struggle. Anybody that knows like Jane Austen knows how hard she had to kind of work at being an author and being taken seriously. A lot of the women back then were not taken seriously as writers. A lot of them used like pen names and things of that nature. I know a few female authors of that time period also wrote under male like pseudonyms just to get their work like seen by publishing houses in the first place. And this brings me to the biggest reason that I very much did not like this particular film. The fact that this film was directed by a woman and that this was the way that she decided to do this story infuriates me. Now, I am not like a crazy feminist. I am not a man hater in any way, shape, or form. I very much enjoyed Fleabag. I am here for a hot priest moment. But the majority of the movie, Emily, centers around the relationship between Emily Bronte and William Whiteman, who was working in the church with her dad at the time. He did stay with the family, and he was known to have been very attractive. And there were rumors going around about William Whiteman and Emily's sister Anne, that the two of them potentially had something going or had liked each other. In this movie, they completely make it fictional. This is what I would consider a historic fiction, this film. Because basically all they did was make it so that this fictional romance between Emily Bronte and this priest, essentially, that was living with them, that they had gotten into this romantic entanglement, that she was sleeping with him, and that they, were in love with each other, and he kind of left her for some ungodly reason. Like, it's not explained. It's just like one day he stops talking to her, which supposedly after his death, she gets a letter that he wrote to her, and that is what inspires her to continue writing and thus write Wuthering Heights. So basically, this entire movie is saying that Emily Bronte would never have had this work of fiction without a man. And that frustrates the ever-living hell out of me, because it was very well known that all of the Bronte sisters, not a single one of them married. I think a couple of her sisters were engaged a few times. Emily herself, I'm sure, had suitors that were interested in her. She did not choose to marry any of them. So to me, it's a little bit irritating, or I find it very irritating, that the story that they had to spin of how Wuthering Heights came to be a thing was not the story of a woman just being a fucking badass and having an amazing talent and being able to put that talent to paper. Instead, what it had to be was this man broke her heart and then somehow, encouraged her through his death and his last letter to continue writing, and that is what spawned her only work of fiction. And I find that a little gross. And like I mentioned earlier, it surprises me that this was directed by a woman and that this was the way that a woman felt like this story should go. It's the irony behind a woman directing films who has obviously worked her ass off to get to a place where she can direct films, directing a film that takes away all of the imagination and creativity from an amazing woman author, and instead kind of gives the majority of that power to a man that she never in real life had much to do with. And it's not that she didn't know him. She would have been very familiar with William Whiteman. Like I said, he lived with the Bronte family, but nothing ever happened between him and Emily that is at least in historical record. Like, there are no letters between them. There is supposedly, they put it into the film that she wrote him a whole bunch of poetry that she then told her sister to burn. But there is no actual historical evidence that there was anything between them other than he was a priest that lived in their home. And if you know anything about Emily Bronte, her history, her life, she is probably to me, she marks me as just incredibly fascinating as an author, because I think that she probably was the first very well-known, complete introvert. And I think a lot of the women writers of that time probably were more introverted, obviously more creative. She had an incredibly difficult time, meeting new people, being around new people. When she traveled, and the movie touches on this very minorly, but it does touch on this, that when she went to the school, to attend the school that her sister was teaching at, she only lasted about 3 months, which in this film, the time frame or the amount of time that passes is not necessarily clear. So you don't really know how old she is, back when they kind of rewind the story a bit. They never tell you how old she is when she dies. She was 30 in real life when she passed, but she only lasted 3 months at this school because she was terribly homesick and had a really difficult time being away from home. And the life that she would have lived back then obviously would have been incredibly sheltered. It's not like they would have met a ton of people or been around a ton of people. And she clearly, I think, had social anxiety or what we would have known as social anxiety today. So I think it's just it's an incredibly powerful story. Her story is that a woman of that time who clearly suffered from some anxiety issues and social awkwardness and just not fitting in very well, even with the other women of her time period, to have written a work of fiction that we still look to today as this incredible work of art. And it it frustrates me that this movie took that away from her and instead centered it completely around romance. Which, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love historical dramas. They're some of my favorites. I will never complain about, the love stories in historical dramas because a lot of the times it's a lot of the point, right? The movie like North and South or Pride and Prejudice, like that is kind of what makes it what it is. This one did not have to be that. And it's a little bit unfortunate that that was the road that they decided to take with it. So for me, even though Emily itself as a film, I think it was tremendously acted. I think the cinematography was great. As a film, I think it's fine. It's good. It's something that I would have enjoyed. And I just feel like I would have enjoyed it a lot better if the priest sexy time love story had not been there. If I could just see something about Emily Bronte that was a little bit more about Emily Bronte and a little bit less about making it a fictional romance story. So for me, this one was not a win, but you guys will have to let me know what you thought of Emily. Subscribe if you want to join the Movie Nerd family. You can find me on Instagram at Cinematic Sarcastic Podcast, and I hope to see you in the next episode.